I have disagreements with Bitcoin Core about mempool policy.
If you don't think about or do something for years, then your memories actually tend to be less reliable than you expect.
My claim to fame, like the thing that got my name out there, started by writing on the Bitcoin Talk forum that Gavin Andresen was wrong and the block size should be limited.
Counterintuitively, it actually seems to be very, very hard to improve. If you improved one thing, you would make something else worse.
I meant with funds.
No one's going to pay you for your spelling mistakes. Like I say, even Satoshi got this wrong and actually had to go and update the Bitcoin code.
The exchanges have a spotty record, so there have been a few exchanges that have stolen or gambled the users' money.
It's notable that there are no examples of any digital currencies with proof of work out there that keep the chain secure purely through transaction fees.
What happens then? Hi Adam, great to have you back in All in Bitcoin. Let's jump into part 2 of what's Bitcoin and dive into mempools. Okay. What are mempools?
So the mempool is when you make a transaction in a Bitcoin network, from a wallet, it gets broadcast into the network and relayed by all of the nodes. And each node has a collection of pending transactions, which it stores in memory, and that's called the mempool. Some nodes may receive different transactions first, and so they may end up with slightly different contents of their mempool. Eventually, if transactions are not processed, they get expired from the mempool, and because the mempool on a given node is limited, when it's full and a new transaction comes, it may kick out the lowest fee transaction. Websites like the Mempool.Space Explorer give you an idea of the average fee that would be used to get into the next block or the one after, and it's sort of sorting all the transactions by fee and seeing how many blocks until yours would fit. And of course, it's changing all the time because there are new transactions arriving. That's what the mempool is. It's the collection of pending transactions.
On Mempool.Space, you sometimes see a block that took 35 minutes to mine and another that was mined in just 4. What causes these time differences and what are those mysterious black blocks?
The reason it can take a different amount of time is because the mining process is randomized. So it's just a sort of statistical phenomena that, we hear that the blocks are 10 minutes on average, but in practice they could be a few seconds or they could be half an hour or even an hour occasionally. So it's just down to randomness. And then occasionally you will get an empty block. And so what causes those is that each miner, when they find a block, they broadcast it in the network. And when other miners see that there's a new block broadcast, they want to mine on top of it. If they don't mine on top of that block, they continue to mine on the previous one. They have to be faster than the rest of the network. So the rational thing to do is to mine on top of the new block. But the problem is they don't have time to verify the block is valid. So they want to verify all the transactions and verify the block is valid. Because if it's not valid and they build on top of it, then they will definitely lose money. And so to avoid that risk, what they do is they mine an empty block on top of it. Because if you mine an empty block, you know that you are not going to conflict with any transactions in it. So they're sort of assuming that the block is valid, but they don't know which transactions are in it. So if they put transactions in a new block and they happen to do one that's already spent, it would make their whole block invalid. So the only way to be sure that there are no conflicts with a previous block is to process no transactions apart from the Coinbase. So that's why.
You mentioned before that some blocks disappear. Can my Bitcoin get lost on a mempool?
So generally what will happen if the block that your transaction is in gets orphaned in a race condition, so that your block was found and another one was found at about the same time and then the other one pulls ahead. Sometimes your transaction will be in both blocks, so it doesn't matter which one wins. Sometimes by chance, your transaction will only be in the one that got orphaned, and in that case, your transaction goes back into the mempool and it will have a chance to go into the following block.
So it can or cannot get lost?
The transactions are sorted by fee. Mm-hmm. So, the first block will use the highest fee. If your transaction is paying a high enough fee that it gets in that block, then it will get processed immediately. But there is a potential that if you put a quite low transaction fee and it only just got into a block that got orphaned, and then the fees go up and they stay higher, there's a potential that your transaction might eventually expire from the mempool or get evicted by, too many other transactions coming.
When does it happen?
Sort of like a week or something. It's a while, so it was a bit confusing for users when this would happen because, the wallet says they've sent the transaction, but it hasn't been received. And so the newer features that people have added to wallets and the network is the ability to increase the fee. So if you can see that the transaction is not getting processed and the fees are going up and the market suddenly increased and stays higher, then you can in the wallet increase the fee to accelerate it, like to have it processed more quickly. Before that feature was introduced into wallets, it was a bit of a disconcerting experience and it was quite hard to get a transaction move forward. You would have to contact a miner and ask them to manually do it or something. And of course, people typically don't know a miner, so they kind of have to wait.
So it can be sorted just by paying more fees.
That's what the wallets have started to do, is allow you to increase the fee. So if you can see it's not happening very quickly, you can increase the priority afterwards, and then it broadcasts a replacement transaction with a larger fee.
Let's get to the juicy part. How can we get our hands on some Bitcoin?
The most direct way is to buy it. So it's either buying it or mining it, or effectively producing something that people will buy from you. So earning it, in other words, right? And that's where the circular economy comes in. So apart from mining or earning, there are a few different ways to buy. So you can buy from an exchange. And of course, most of the exchanges have an onboarding process where they want, proof of address and things like that. Some people resent the kind of paperwork or the privacy of doing that. But I think it's also to consider that if something happens to you and, some relatives inherit your bank accounts and so on, if there's no document to prove it's yours, they might have difficulty claiming, what's in the account. But the other thing you can do, which is generally recommended, is to buy Bitcoin on some platform and then take it off and store it yourself in a wallet, right? There are a few different types of services. One is just where you buy Bitcoin, there's a listed price, you buy and pay with a debit card or a linked bank account or something like that, or with stablecoins. And there are others which are more for traders, so you can sort of set a price and it will only buy if and when the price reaches that level. Then there are also some sort of peer-to-peer kinds of ways to buy, where you will find somebody in the local community or where you are and trade for cash, or sometimes they have a way to sort of an escrow agent. You can pay the other person with cash or with a wire transfer, account to account or PayPal. And then when the escrow agent confirms that they've received the money, then they will pass on the Bitcoin. So they kind of escrow the Bitcoin in case of a dispute. So a few services like that as well, like Peach Bitcoin, which is a wallet designed for that, or Hodl Hodl has a service.
For small amounts, for big amounts?
Probably there are some limits for payments in Europe, for typical wire transfer. I don't know the European limit, but, in some countries there's maybe 10, 20,000 limit on fast wire transfers. Of course, with the trading platforms, there are less limits.
What's the difference between KYC and non-KYC Bitcoin, and what does KYC stand for?
I think it's like a banking concept, know your customer. Financial institution will ask for that because they're required to abide by banking regulations. But the things which are more user to user sometimes are not KYC. Of course, if you just transact in a conference or with a friend and say, I need some euros, can I sell you some Bitcoin? Then they'll do that and that will be fine. But some of these escrow services, it's not really, that private because, the buyer has made a wire transfer between two bank accounts. And that usually involves knowing, the name and account number, which does identify the other person, right?
Yeah. Let's say that a person buys some Bitcoin on an exchange and he worries about data leaks or $5 rent attacks or confiscation from the government or just being sued. Without getting too technical, how can this person make his Bitcoin more private?
Of course, if you buy it on exchange, the first problem is that the tax authorities and the government via reporting from any kind of financial institution knows you have it. So if they know you have something and they're trying to seize your property or your bank accounts, then they will ask for it, right? And maybe it's difficult to say no, because the alternative might be, contempt of court, which in some countries would mean you're in jail until you agree to hand it over, right? And of course, the wrench attack, i.e. that you have a risk of burglary or hijacking where somebody tries to coerce you into giving access to some coins is a consideration as well. So I think generally it's a bit of a trade-off. You can store the backups in other locations, like a safety deposit box, which is maybe not with a bank, but a depository that specializes in that. Or split into parts. There are multi-sig now. Like a 2 of 3 multi-sig is interesting, because even if you lose one, you can still access it. If you store those in different locations, that can help. If you're somebody that travels a lot, maybe you can get a deposit box in another country. That would make it already a bit safer. But it's not an easy challenge for people to do this logistically, for the individual to have a good place to store backups, let's say.
If you have a Bitcoin that you bought on an exchange, to make it private, for example, CoinJoin, would that be an option?
When you're buying Bitcoin on an exchange, you can potentially break the linkage between, the coins that are yours, the UTXOs that are yours, and that exchange via other financial activity. I mean, if you're spending a bit and you're getting change, it will generally get more ambiguous over time. And of course, CoinJoin is a way to do that also. But if the government via exchange reporting knows you have the coins, then that's the first problem. They won't say, give me this UTXO. Or the court might say, give me the coins that you bought in this transaction from this, government report that the exchange sent. And then you have to explain why you don't have them, if you've actually spent them, right? So it puts the onus on you. Whereas if you bought them in person, cash from a friend or something, then that initial problem is reduced, which is they don't know you have them. And so they don't know to ask. Now, I mean, of course, if there is a tax event, it'd probably be your obligation to disclose the profit on it. But the Bitcoins you get without KYC are better insurance policy.
What are tainted coins, and should we care about them?
I think there is a phenomena because of the interaction between bearer, peer-to-peer spending coins and exchanges and even banks now that will take Bitcoin deposits, that they rely on third-party services to analyze the coins and provide some score. And they will give a negative score if a coin's been used for online gambling, if it's been used on a grey market website. Unfortunately, even if it's been used in a CoinJoin, they will sometimes place a negative score on it. Banks or exchanges might refuse the deposit of a so-called tainted coin. I think it's a bit artificial, but anyway, it's a factor. Now, I think you want generally for money to be fungible, and there's some historic case law about this, which is if money is not fungible, it makes people nervous to accept it, because banknotes have serial numbers, and there was some historic case in a few countries where they started the fungibility rules for cash. And so they said that, it doesn't matter about the history of the cash transaction. Cash is cash, and the current holder is the owner. Bitcoin de facto has fungibility, and I think we clearly want that to be the case, or it can create a problem for its fungibility and acceptance.
Some people leave their Bitcoins on an exchange, but we always recommend moving it off. Why is that so important?
Well, I think the main issue is that the exchanges have a spotty record. So there have been a few exchanges that have been hacked or turned out to have basically stolen or gambled the user's money, or been hacked and not disclosed it and just kept operating. So that was the case with infamously Mt. Gox, which is a very long time ago now, I think 11 years ago. And finally, users are getting very drawn out bankruptcy process. Eventually users got, 15 to 20% of their coins back. The rest were stolen. Unfortunately, they were stolen and the theft wasn't disclosed for some years. So people kept using the exchange, not realizing there was a theft. And of course, the most recent kind of large scale thing was the FTX, which was also a kind of insider theft situation. So I think the point is for long-term savings, you're safer to take it out of the exchange and store it in cold storage.
What's a Bitcoin wallet?
So it's generally a piece of software with which you receive and transact and save Bitcoin. So there are software wallets, which are on smartphones or laptops. Those are convenient, but they are effectively more like hot wallets because your device is connected to the internet. So there's some risk of malware. You know, the keys are in the memory of the device, so they're not quite secure. And then there's the so-called hardware wallet, which puts the keys on a separate device. So it's much more secure and not directly connected to the internet. And so the hardware wallet is generally paired with one of the software wallets. So you use the software wallet user interface to look at the coins, to decide how much you're going to send to what address, and then you verify the details on the hardware wallet.
What's a public and a private key?
So this is actually an older concept than Bitcoin. The public key is what allows somebody to verify signature, and a private key enables you to sign. So it's a kind of analog of signing on paper a signature and somebody looking at it and seeing that it's unique and it's yours, except it's a digital analog. So it makes some kind of calculation involving the private key and the message that you're signing, which allows anybody to verify it with a public key. Now, in the case of Bitcoin, what you're signing is the approval to spend a coin. That's where the public and private keys come in. And effectively, the address that you're sending a coin to, you can think of it loosely like a public key.
Okay. And what's a seed phrase?
So a seed phrase is a clever way to back up a lot of private keys. So generally in Bitcoin, each coin has a different private key and a different address that you use to receive. And so as an individual, it's not like a bank account where you have one bank account. If you want somebody to pay you, you give them the bank account. Instead, you give each person a different address each time, a new address. And that coin will be spendable by this key pair, the public key and the private key. To protect from funds loss, you will need to back up all these private keys. And that's actually what the original Bitcoin core wallet did. It generated 100 private keys and you had to back them up periodically, because if you used more than 100 transactions, there would be new keys being generated. And if you didn't back them up and your computer failed, you could lose those coins. So there was a new standard introduced, which was the HD wallet standard. And with that, there's a single backup information, the seed, which is used to generate all of the private keys in the future. So you can do one backup at the beginning, and that will give you access and allow you to recover any future coins that you receive.
You said that an address is effectively a key?
Yeah, so an address is an instruction for the sender to send coins to, and it includes, either directly or via a hash, the public key that you will have to sign with the private key to spend it. So it's the way for the receiver to say that they would later approve sending this transaction with a signature from the private key, and there's a direct link between the private key and the public key.
When I'm moving my Bitcoin, what am I really moving? Where is my Bitcoin stored?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept because people feel that the coins are in their wallet, but actually the coins are probably better thought of as in the network. It's just that your wallet has the keys to authorize changing the ownership.
You previously mentioned multi-sig wallets. Why would we use one? Can you elaborate a little bit more?
Mm-hmm. I think the point is if you have a single sig wallet, then it has one private key. And if something goes wrong with that wallet, like it's compromised, then access to that seed allows all those coins to be spent. Whereas with a multi-sig wallet, you can end up with 3 different seeds. And, if you do a 2 out of 3 multi-sig, it means that any 2 of those seeds are enough to spend the coins. But the procedure for spending the coins is a little more complicated. You'll have to use 2 wallets, maybe from different manufacturers and software vendors, and put the respective seeds into it. And then, you'll start a transaction on one wallet, but you'll have to transfer some information to the second wallet to co-sign it. It's really like a company bank account, or you can talk with a bank and get this kind of account for a family where you're basically saying don't approve transfers from this account without 2 out of 3 of the directors of the company or members of the family co-signing. And you can give them instructions about how many signatures you need to move the money. And so Bitcoin has a way to do this with multi-sig. And really the point is that you can have some redundancy. If one of them is lost, you can still spend the money. And so that the risk of spending is spread across 2 devices. So and if there turns out to be a security defect in one manufacturer, it still won't be spendable because you can rely on the second independent manufacturer to be secure.
What do you see as the biggest responsibility in owning Bitcoin?
It gives you self-sovereignty, as people like to say, which is empowering because, now your funds can't be seized. You don't have to rely on a third party. It protects you from that. But the flip side of it is that you now have a lot of responsibility. There's no help desk. So you are self-reliant, but that means you have to be very careful to do it safely and making sure you have the backups because there's no one that can help you if you lose the backups.
Any tips or do's or don'ts?
Never share your private key. And I think the other thing that some people make mistakes with is when they're told to back something up, their typical action will be to take a photograph on a smartphone. And that's not a good idea because the smartphones are sometimes backing up your photographs in the cloud. And then the cloud backup can sometimes be hacked. And of course, if it's just casual photos, there's not much incentive to hack them. But if you have a photograph of a seed, that could be quite bad.
What's the one thing about Bitcoin that most people think they understand, but they actually get wrong?
I think generally Bitcoin is possible to understand reasonably well in a simplified way. And as you get to learn more, you find more details. And of course, there are some sort of misconceptions in terms of, are the coins in your wallet or are the coins in the network and you just have the authorization keys? But I think that's just a perfectly reasonable way to think about it. Probably for people who are not used to signatures and private keys, which is a novel concept, it's a bit confusing that some of the information they have to keep secret and other information they're sending to third parties. So they really have to sort of learn to not get fooled because there are a lot of people who are trying to imitate the support stuff from the wallets and things like that, right? To try and persuade people or email people things to get them to type the seed into a website or into some other software. So you really have to get defensive that you're never going to share the seed with anybody. Even the real operators of the wallet would never ask you for that. So I think that's really the thing. Just keep that to yourself. Don't put it online. Don't back it up on a cloud storage. Don't take a photograph on an Android or Apple phone because they do online backup. So you really need to keep it offline, off of computers, off of smartphones, generally off of any internet connected device for your backups. And maybe your house is not really designed as a safety deposit box, right? You have friends or relatives coming in and out, and if somebody can guess where it is, they could potentially steal it, right? So safe places to store take some imagination. I know because there are another kind of failure mode that you become too imaginative and hide it too well, and then you forget where you put it. So you shouldn't discount 2 risks you're trading off. One is that it gets stolen, and the other one is that you forget or you lose it. Forgetting or losing might be almost as high risk, actually. Because I think people have maybe an intuition that their memory is good, and it is good in the short term, but if you don't think about or do something for years, then your memories actually tend to be less reliable than you expect. So it's a common intuition mistake.
And lastly, if you could change one thing about Bitcoin today, what would you change?
I think a lot of the parameters are reasonably well chosen in hindsight, looking at, how Bitcoin evolved. The halving rate, it could have been over a different number of years, or it could have been steeper or shallower change in supply, or it could have been smooth, without the halving periods. I think the one thing that when I first got more active in Bitcoin in 2013, I was looking at privacy. Now, unfortunately, there's no simple and reliable way to improve that. And of course, Bitcoin likes to use very robust, simple technology to be dependable. So surprisingly, there's not really much you can change. And this seems to be counterintuitive to people because most first technologies, like the first airplane, the first car, had a huge amount of room for improvement. They were kind of prototypes, very inferior compared to the modern version. But with Bitcoin, it seems that there's actually counterintuitively very little you can change that would improve it. So when I started, spent some months trying to think of any way to improve it, I was thinking I might be able to improve it. But after 4 months of that, I realized that it's almost perfect. If you improved one thing, you would make something else worse. So counterintuitively, it actually seems to be very, very hard to improve.
And do you think privacy could be implemented in the first layer, or it would be a second, third layer solution?
So, I mean, there have been some incremental sort of privacy-related things included, but there have been some privacy things done in layer 2s. Now, the very private DigiCash kind of technology only really works with a single trusted server. There are some privacy solutions that work in a distributed network, but they're less efficient, or they have a worse security guarantee. So there are some candidates that people are working on, including some people at Blockstream, but there's nothing that is kind of immediately ready to, it has a trade-off which might be difficult for Bitcoin to adopt.
Adam, it's been amazing having you on What's Bitcoin Part 1 and 2, and thank you for sharing so generously.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Hi, Peter. Great to have you back on What's Bitcoin Part 2. Let's pick up where Adam left off and dig into nodes.
Yeah, sure.
What exactly is a node? How is it different from a full node? And why are they important?
The technical term that's relevant is fully verifying node. Okay. And what that means is a node that validates all of the rules of the Bitcoin consensus protocol and determines what the UTXO set should be as a particular block height. And again, the UTXO set is the set of all coins that have not been spent as of a certain time. So a lot of people incorrectly use a full node to mean a node that has all the data. But the thing with Bitcoin is that to fully verify after a certain point in time, you only need the UTXO set, that is the set of the database of coins that haven't been spent. You don't actually need to know all of the transactions in the past. You should validate them before, but once you validate that data, you can delete it. And this is why most nodes on the network are probably pruned nodes, which just means nodes that have discarded old historical transactions. And those nodes still validate all the same rules. They're just as correct. It's just you can't ask them for old information about old transactions. Archival nodes are what actually maintain that data. And in fact, you could, in theory, have an archival node that didn't actually validate the data was correct. You would have to still validate if you're syncing off of it. So full node actually refers to both types, either a node that has all the data or a node that's deleted older data.
Why should I run my own node, and how hard it is to set one up?
First of all, it's not that hard to go set one up. I mean, Bitcoin is just a piece of software. If you have a laptop with like 20 gigs of hard drive space free, you can just run the Bitcoin software and it will sit there and download the 800 gigs or something worth of blockchain data, and it will validate all that data and arrive at the current UTXO set. And if you want to keep running that node, you can just keep running that node. You don't need to do anything special for this. You don't need to have a special piece of hardware or a separate computer. Yeah, the UTXO set isn't that big. The full set of data that creates the UTXO set, like all transactions in history, that's on the order of like 800 gigabytes right now. So, it's bigger, but certainly a lot of computers have that much space anyway. I mean, I have a archival node on my laptop that has every transaction in the history of Bitcoin. But the reason why you want this really comes down to validating coins. A full node means that you can actually validate that your money is real without trusting someone else. That's what's important about a full node. And
you need to run your full node 24/7 on your computer?
Nope. They will work just fine if you turn them on when your computer's on. If you leave it off for a while, it might take a while to sync back to the most current state because, it needs to download all the transaction data between when you last ran it to now. But a node is just a piece of software. Just downloads the data and that's fine. Nothing requires you to run a full node full time. Nothing requires you to make it public and let other people use it. It's just a piece of software that validates data.
What's Bitcoin Core and who manages it?
Bitcoin Core is the most widely used implementation of the Bitcoin protocol. And it also in practice defines a standard of what the Bitcoin protocol is. And this kind of gets down to an interesting thing about really the limits of what humans are capable of. because the nature of the Bitcoin protocol means that if it's going to work, your computer, your node, and my node have to agree exactly about every single transaction. If there's even the slightest disagreement, we get out of sync and we can no longer transact with each other. And in what we've found from sort of a computer programming, computer science point of view is that trying to write a second implementation of Bitcoin is essentially impossible. It is so difficult to get every single technical choice exactly identical that no one's successfully done it. People have tried. There's, as an example, BTCD, which is a complete rewrite of Bitcoin Core in the language Go. Bitcoin Core is written in C++. So, they tried to rewrite the whole thing in Go. And roughly like 1 or 2 times a year, someone finds yet another consensus bug where BTCD disagrees with Bitcoin Core. And this is why so many people use Core, because they want to use the thing that everyone else uses to make sure they're actually on the Bitcoin protocol, not some accidentally different thing. Now, that doesn't mean that Bitcoin Core is centralized. Of course, first of all, it is just software. You can just create your own copy of it. All right, like nobody's gatekeeping access to that code base. It's just code. You can download it for free. It's open source software. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that for people who want to make a change to Bitcoin Core's policies rather than the consensus, you can just fork the code base and change the parts of it you want to change. I mean, I personally have done that. Like I have disagreements with Bitcoin Core about mempool policy, not the consensus algorithm, but rather how transactions should be propagated around the network and which transactions should. And because I just forked Bitcoin Core and made my own changes, my fork of Bitcoin Core, Libra Relay, will work fine. It will not disagree about the protocol, the consensus, but it will change how your node propagates transactions around the network.
Understand. Who funds Bitcoin Core developers?
A lot of people do. And I can kind of say I am one of those quote-unquote Bitcoin Core developers. My Libra Relay is an example. I've asked for donations, and so far I've got a bit of money paying for my time running Libra Relay. Other people get a lot more money working full-time on Bitcoin Core. There's a lot of institutions funding Bitcoin Core developers. One example is there's Chaincode, who was just started by some very rich people who wanted to go do something with the rest of their life after they'd made their billions in the stock market. There's Blockstream, which is a company that needs Bitcoin Core to exist. There's Brink, which is like another charitable institution. And I believe this might not be true anymore, but certainly in the past, MIT has funded some core developers. Like there's just a lot of sources of funding. And like any open source project, some of it's just volunteers.
And how can we contribute?
Well, as an example, my first contribution to Bitcoin Core was after reading some of the code, I noticed a mistake in the grammar of one of the messages it printed out, and I corrected that mistake.
I meant with funds.
Well, how can you contribute funds? Well, no one's going to pay you for your spelling mistakes. What it always comes down to is finding someone who works on the code base and giving them money. Now, that might be through a grant institution like, say, OpenSats. Mm-hmm. It might be something as simple as just finding a developer who you think does good work and just paying them. In the past, I've had sponsorship to work on Bitcoin Core, and some of the times that sponsorship was as simple as, every couple of weeks I gave the guy a list of what hours I'd worked, and he sent me some money.
Yeah. If I run Bitcoin Core, am I fully in control of my transactions, or am I still relying on others to validate them?
Your node validates all the data it receives, whether it's your transaction or someone else's. Now, you might be thinking in terms of mining, though, because, validating the transaction is correct is one thing, but getting it into the chain through proof of work, that is done by mining. And anyone can be a miner. Anyone can potentially create a block. But the way the economics work is that since it requires so much hash power on average to find a block, miners then aggregate in what are called pools. And then we get shares. We each contribute a bit of hash power, and then we get paid in proportion to how much hash power we contribute.
I understand. Let's talk about war. What happened during the Blocksize War in 2017, and how was it sorted?
The so-called Blocksize War was really disagreements about the direction Bitcoin should go. And the disagreement was really between tech people and companies who understood how Bitcoin actually works and people who would much rather it be a either system they could control or sort of a quick and dirty solution. What it comes down to is really, well, how big should Bitcoin block be? Should they be small enough that anyone can run a Bitcoin node and validate them? Or should we make transactions cheaper by making the block size bigger, allowing more transactions per second, but meaning that anyone who runs a node needs to process a lot more data? Now, another coin that went the other way is BSV, which is actually a fork of Bitcoin. So, Bitcoin split into Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, with Bitcoin Cash being the incompatible fork. And then Bitcoin Cash had disagreements in its community and again split into BSV, who changed the code yet again. And in BSV, basically there is no block size limit. Currently, the number of BSV nodes in the entire world is probably less than 10, because so much data has been put on the BSV chain that it's actually very hard to download a copy of that data and validate it. If you or I want to run a node, it is extremely challenging to run one, because how do we get those terabytes and terabytes of data? It's so much data that in the BSV community, hardly anyone can even afford to run a node, which means that BSV is actually a centralized trusted system. If you want to run a BSV wallet, you're really relying on a very small number of people to do it for you. And it won't be surprising if one day, the BSV blockchain actually gets lost, because the number of nodes is going to drop so much that no one's going to have a copy of it. We're already at the point where, things like block explorers and BSV are failing because it's just so challenging keeping up with an enormous torrent of data. Now, in the case of BSV, frankly, that data is all fake. It's BSV at this point is purely a scam. It's a coin that people get convinced to buy, and there's no real utility to it. And they create these fake transactions to pump up the transaction volume to claim that it's a real thing. But, it represents basically no actual economic activity. It's a cautionary tale. It shows that if you push things to the extremes, the system just fails. Ethereum is somewhere in between. Ethereum has a block size limit, but not the way Bitcoin does. It's not a fixed limit. And in Ethereum, again, running a node is very challenging. If you want to actually run an archival node without trusting anyone else, you could be sitting there, or even on a fast, server-grade internet connection, you could be sitting for weeks trying to go sync it up. And this also introduces tech risk. Like in Bitcoin, if we make a mistake, and maybe suddenly people need to start up new nodes and resync certain parts of the chain, it's not that challenging to do, because an average internet connection, even a consumer one, can download the entire chain in a matter of hours to maybe, 2 or 3 days. We can fix problems very quickly. If you need to resync the chain because there's a technical fault that made the UTXO set get out of sync, well, you hit go, and on a very fast computer, it'll resync in maybe an hour. That means if something goes wrong, we can fix it much, much faster than a chain where all the transactions are on the chain and it's enormous.
So it was a war about centralization.
Yes, ultimately about centralization. And what it comes down to is that the people who wanted the block size to be big, they wanted cheap transactions on chain, which is a very simple thing to do. But the outcome of this would have been a Bitcoin that was truly used by far less people. You'd have a lot of people, using Bitcoin since they might own some, but they wouldn't be validating what they actually own. And that's a very dangerous position to be in.
How was it sorted?
The so-called war, it was sorted on social media. It was sorted in conferences. It was a battle of minds. And because Bitcoin is not controlled by any one person, to win the Blocksize War meant you had to convince a whole community that you were correct and the other side was wrong. How did we convince them? Well, we wrote good arguments. I personally, my claim to fame, the thing that got my name out there, the thing that kind of made me famous within this community, started by writing on the Bitcoin Talk forum that Gavin Andresen was wrong and the block size should be limited. And I had a very good argument for why. Maybe it wasn't the most technically perfect argument, but the thing with my argument was very easy to understand.
What was your argument?
Well, the first one I made was an argument that the incentives were bad. So Gavin had this argument that the incentives would be such that miners would automatically limit the block size to a reasonable value, because if it was too big, they'd lose money. And I showed how it was actually the opposite. For a miner that had a lot of hash power, the bigger the block size, the more money they would make at the expense of other miners. The technical reason is kind of down to like stale rate. It's that blocks take time to propagate. If you have a lot less hash power than me, because my block is so big, it'll take a while to get to you. But by the time it gets to you, I'll probably find another block. So you are losing money, and I am earning more money per unit hash power than you are, which itself is a strong centralization pressure. And I wrote that argument in a way that anyone, pretty much anyone could understand. And what do you know? People read it, they understood it. You had the next group of people saying, hey, we should limit the block size.
Are there any current issues that could trigger a similar conflict?
I don't think there's anything that would trigger a conflict as fundamental as the Blocksize War. I think we certainly can have debate about what new opcodes to add to Bitcoin, what new features to add to Bitcoin. Upgrades to the Bitcoin protocol are, again, a matter of social consensus and convincing people that it's a good idea. But nothing that comes to mind will be as intense as a Blocksize War. Now, having said that, maybe governments try to ban Bitcoin. That could be a very big argument, but that argument wouldn't be Bitcoiners against Bitcoiners. It would be, the world against governments.
What about KYC versus non-KYC Bitcoin?
Well, that's a kind of Bitcoiners versus governments argument you could have, but the dynamics of that wouldn't look like the Blocksize War. They would be much more us against them than us against us.
What's the difference between a soft fork and a hard fork?
The difference is really about how compatibility works. So the key thing with soft fork is that the rules are changed in a way that makes things that were previously allowed not allowed. What it means in practice is after a soft fork, if you're running a non-supporting version of Bitcoin Core or whatever implementation you use, because all the old rules are still being followed, your node will stay in sync. It might not understand some of the new features, but from a technical point of view, it will stay in sync. And that's really about backwards compatibility. So in Bitcoin, mostly speaking, we've only ever had soft forks. Certain things in the past were arguably hard forks, but we're talking like in the days when there might have been 100 nodes on the entire network and Satoshi was still around. That's not really relevant today. Today, there's far more people out there.
Segwit
was a soft fork.
And it came after the Blocksize War, no?
Kind of came during-ish.
During?
Yeah. The notable thing about Segwit is, so what Segwit did from a technical point of view is it said that certain scripts that previously could have been spent by anyone now had more rules attached. So that goes from a coin that, quote unquote, anyone can spend to a coin that you can only spend by providing a certain signature. And because Bitcoin's designed to be upgraded, the taking away thing doesn't really mean anything in practice. There's an infinite set of possible transaction types. You have version numbers as an example that go up to 256. We've only ever used version 0, 1, and 2 in the consensus. And every one of these versions can apply new rules on top of existing rules. Now, a hard fork is something where you can add rules that are potentially incompatible with older versions. So in a hard fork, you might have a block that previous nodes do not see as valid. A perfect example being an increase in block size. The block size limit says that blocks must be less than a certain size. Well, a hard fork could be to raise that limit, and now you have a block that previous versions would reject. And that potentially means the currency forks. Perfect example of this is the Bcash fork. That increased the block size. Well, that is not valid according to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin at that point split into the Bcash coin, accepted by a far smaller community, and then the Bitcoin coin. And you kind of see this in, of course, the value of Bcash versus Bitcoin.
I thought that when Segwit was implemented, the capacity of the block that was 1 meg.
Yeah.
After Segwit, it allowed you to include in the block up to 4.
So Segwit was sort of this one-time block size increase, because what Segwit did is it said, in addition to having the main blockchain, there's going to be an additional set of data that's validated where we put all of the signatures. So signatures that would have been in the 1 meg chain can now be in this 4 meg max section. But the way that's implemented is not something where you can just increase that indefinitely. It's purely saying signatures that used to be this place can now be in this place. And in this place, the size limit is counted as, roughly speaking, 4 megs. So depending on how you use the chain, it's a block size increased 4 megs versus 1. It's a bit more complex than that because in practice, signatures aren't that big. So for a lot of transaction types, the limit is still basically, only a little bit bigger than 1 meg. But certainly for certain types of transaction types, it increases the limit to 4.
Some worry about Bitcoin security. With each halving reducing the block reward, will transaction fees and Bitcoin's price be enough to keep miners incentivized and the network secure?
Not necessarily. Like right now, even with multiple halvings, the vast majority of revenue to miners is still the block subsidy. And there's nothing in Bitcoin that ensures that transaction fees are enough to keep Bitcoin secure. Now, in fairness, you can't say for sure that the subsidy is going to be enough to go keep Bitcoin secure against all possible attackers. Maybe there's going to be some attacker with a truly enormous budget who could 51% attack Bitcoin. But the problem is that of the value of Bitcoin, there's nothing that ensures that a certain percentage of that value will actually go to fees. And if Bitcoin does get attacked, the dynamics of an attack don't necessarily result in Bitcoin being saved. So it would be much better had Bitcoin be designed where a certain percentage of all wealth in Bitcoin was automatically going to miners every year. And that is what the inflation subsidy was. But unfortunately, Bitcoin was not designed that way. And it's notable that there are no examples of any digital currencies with proof of work out there that keep the chain secure purely through transaction fees. They are all based on inflation.
And you are pro
Yeah,
inflation?
If I could go back in time and rewrite Bitcoin somehow, I would have designed it that every single block always created a certain amount of Bitcoin in perpetuity. And if you do that, you actually get a stable monetary supply because a certain amount of coins get lost every year anyway. So eventually the amount of coins you create and the amount of coins that get lost balance out, and you get a stable money supply.
Can you break down the concepts of reversed and double spend transaction and what's a 51% attack you just mentioned?
Well, there's a couple different contexts when you can talk about double spending. So like one context is you can say an unconfirmed transaction. And an unconfirmed transaction can be double spent in the sense that you can sign a conflicting transaction, usually with a higher fee. And if one transaction pays higher fee than another, miners have incentive to mine the higher fee one. And, Bitcoin wallets use this all the time to do things like increase fees, to undo mistaken transactions, to, modify exactly who gets paid by a transaction. There's all kinds of reasons double spends of unconfirmed transactions happen. Now, a double spend of a confirmed transaction is much more difficult because blocks have to be found that conflict with the other blocks and create a more work chain. Basically, nobody does that. Blocks getting undone happens by accident once in a while because, if you're a miner and I'm a miner, well, we might find a block at the exact same time, or at least close enough in time that I didn't know about your block or you didn't know about my block.
What happens then?
Well, we wait till we find one more block, and whichever one wins becomes the most worked chain. Because remember, the rule in Bitcoin is you synchronize the chain that has the most work. Not the longest chain, but the one with the most work. And in certain circumstances, like most cases, longest chain is the same thing as most work, but there are certain circumstances where that's not true. And Satoshi famously screwed this up. Bitcoin shipped with the longest chain as a rule, but that's actually broken in certain cases. So it got changed later to be most work change. But, ignoring that, most work is the way we talk about it. And very occasionally, you could even get, say, 2 blocks in a row, where you'll just happen to find 2 blocks at the same time. But it's a probability thing. Eventually, somebody's going to come out ahead, and then that becomes the chain. And from the point of view of nodes that sync to the wrong chain, they will undo the effect of those blocks and then redo with the new one. And in that circumstance, yeah, confirmed transaction could get double spent. It doesn't happen very often, but it can. And yeah, you could call it a reverse transaction. That really comes down to like probability and economics. If I were receiving like $1 billion, yeah, I would want to wait for a couple of confirmations to make it very unlikely, even just by accident or by bad luck, for this to get reversed. An example I actually run into myself is my open timestamps calendars. The way the code works is it waits for 5 confirmations before adding the timestamp to the database. And 5 blocks in a row getting reversed is extraordinarily unlikely. It's the kind of thing that's only happened, maybe twice, 3 times at most in Bitcoin's entire history. And in that case, only due to technical failures. So
when did that happen?
Well, one happened when someone found a bug that could create Bitcoins out of thin air. Mm-hmm. There was another example where there was a bug in how the UTXO set was recorded that would cause certain nodes to crash. And in both those cases, like a lot of blocks got invalidated. But, we're talking technical failures here, not bad luck. Like 5 blocks getting invalidated by purely bad luck of just people repeatedly finding the same block at the same time, it's extraordinarily unlikely. So the 51% TAC is that anyone who wants to control the Bitcoin chain can get at least over 50% of hash power, and then they can reliably, eventually, create a more work chain that everyone else will switch to. And if you have that type of control, you can do things like, for instance, censor transactions. Right? If I don't like people paying to a certain address, I can discard all transactions that pay to that address. I could also potentially reorganize the blockchain by starting my mining further back in time, and then eventually I'll come out ahead and a whole bunch of blocks will become invalid. The main thing that Bitcoin has that prevents that attack is that hash power is naturally distributed. And it's distributed because opportunities for cheap power and ways to get rid of heat are naturally distributed. The cheapest form of energy out there is renewables like solar, wind, hydropower. Well, renewables are naturally distributed because the sun is naturally distributed. The sun falls on the entire Earth. There's no one place on Earth that has all of the energy. Even the biggest hydro plants in the world are not that big compared to all of the hydropower in the world. So if you want the cheapest possible hash power, you got to go to a lot of different places all over the world, and that naturally tends to be owned by a large variety of people. Now, pools, they tend towards centralization because pools can offer lower variance if they're more centralized, but the hash power pointed at the pool is inherently decentralized. So if a pool does something bad, in theory at least, miners will point their hash power elsewhere. Now, we haven't seen much of this play out in practice. We'll see what happens if push comes to shove. But so far, that's your main defense against 51% attacks. Plus, of course, the fact that there's so much money going into mining that it would be incredibly expensive for someone, just a third party, say, I want to buy up enough hash power to 51% attack Bitcoin.
Has there ever been a successful 51% attack
on Bitcoin? No. Yeah. On other currencies, there have been. Although the irony there is a lot of those attacks aren't that successful in the sense that they don't actually cause the coin to shut down, because so many of these other smaller currencies that have been attacked are so marginal with like so little economic use case that the only people buying and selling them are traders. And traders aren't necessarily affected by a 51% attack because their coins are on exchange. If I send you money on an exchange, usually that's just recorded in the databases at the exchange. It doesn't actually have to go to the chain. So I can trade with you even while 51% attack is going on. I just can't withdraw later. And the challenge is you have to outspend like half of the entire amount of money going to mining. It is a lot of money. Plus, where do you get the hash power? Are you going to go buy miners? Mm-hmm. Well, the amount of mining equipment necessary to mine one block in a reasonable amount of time, it's millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars. There's probably cheaper ways to harm the Bitcoin than that.
Is it still possible to do a 51% attack?
I mean, it's possible.
Enough money and
like
energy
with enough money and resources, you can end all life on Earth. You know, like the sky's the limit if you have infinite money, but no one out there seems to have enough money in the willpower to kill off Bitcoin.
And you said that there are easier ways to kill Bitcoin.
Probably. You know, one example is it might be easier to attack Bitcoin by attacking exchanges, you know, passing laws, making like Bitcoin illegal. I mean, that kind of thing.
Yeah. What about quantum computing? Is there a potential risk to Bitcoin's security?
Bitcoin's main algorithm, the proof of work algorithm, quantum computers don't directly do it any harm. There's a potential that quantum computers would let you build much cheaper miners and mine much more efficiently, but it's not clear anyone will ever be able to make a quantum computer that actually do that. There's also the possibility of using quantum computers to go break secret keys that let you spend Bitcoin. And with the right type of quantum computer, you could go spend a lot of Bitcoin. But the thing with quantum computing in general is it's just not clear it's a real thing. You know, no one's built a quantum computer that actually does anything useful with regards to cryptography. People build quantum computers that do a different type of problem called quantum annealing. But that's more like an analog computer in the sense that it, you know, does sort of this fuzzy solving a problem. Quantum computer for cryptography, it needs to be able to solve a very specific problem in a very specific way with very high precision, if you will. And it's just not clear that quantum computers that can actually do that are physically possible. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I mean, I used to go work in an industry with a lot of physicists who knew stuff about this. And if you ask them about quantum computing, they tend to just laugh and say, yeah, you know, this does not feel like it's physically real. This feels, you know, like something that physics doesn't actually allow. And it may be the case in the process of trying to invent quantum computers, we find more about what physics is possible to, you know, possible of. It might be that we find physical limits that we just didn't know existed. Or maybe we don't. I don't know yet. But it's hard to speculate about sci-fi. And at the moment, you know, quantum computers to break Bitcoin are sci-fi.
Peter, before we wrap it up, I have a few closing questions for you. What's the one thing about Bitcoin that most people think they understand, but actually they get completely wrong?
The difference between longest chain and most work chain is probably the most common technical misperception that you see with Bitcoin. People think longest chain is it, and that's just not true. Like I say, even Satoshi got this wrong and actually had to go and update the Bitcoin code. And the Bitcoin white paper still says longest chain. So, you know, you can see why people would get this wrong. It's a very common misconception.
A book or source you would like to recommend to learn more about Bitcoin?
You're not going to like this answer, but get the Bitcoin Core source code and read it. Like, and frankly, I mean, this is what I did way back in the day. Like, I took the Bitcoin Core source code and I sat down with it on my computer and I got a pad of paper and, you know, as I recall, I went through the code that received a block from a peer on the network and just read through how does this actually work, and I drew out diagrams and figured it all out. It's not that hard. I mean, Bitcoin, there are a lot of things, you know, technical things out there that are far more complex than Bitcoin. Bitcoin, to understand how does the code base actually work, is not that hard. You know, a couple weekends with pad of paper, you should be able to do it. Now, you may have to be kind of persistent. You know, you kind of have to know a bit about programming, but it's not that hard. And, you know, at the time, I was actually working at that geophysics job. And, you know, that's an example of something which is far harder to understand than Bitcoin. You know, understanding how the heck they use math to, like, deconvolute gravity gradiometer readings into maps of gravity. You know, you need so much more experience with math and science to understand that than Bitcoin.
So what's been the most exciting moment in your Bitcoin journey so far?
I mean, you could probably say, if you're really talking about excitement, like the negotiations around the Blocksize War and that kind of period of time. You know, that was a very interesting part of Bitcoin's history. But, you know, may not necessarily be the sort of excitement you'd want to repeat.
Lastly, is Bitcoin for everyone?
Well, it could be. I mean, it's plausible Bitcoin becomes a world currency that the majority of the population use. It's plausible it doesn't. But, it could happen that way. I mean, Bitcoin is a class of technology that certainly everyone could use in their lives. It's not something that's specialized like other things, Not everyone needs to have a CNC mill in their basement, but you could imagine a future where everyone has a Bitcoin wallet.
Any final thoughts you would like to add?
Well, I think if you're technically inclined, take my advice and actually read the Bitcoin's core source code. So there's so many technically inclined people who haven't done the basics to really understand Bitcoin, and it's just something I strongly advise people to do. I gotta admit, it's easier to do it with an older version of Bitcoin because the code back then was easier to read and a bit shorter. But do the work. That's what it takes.
Well, Peter, thanks for all the great insights. I've learned a lot, and it's been great to have you on the pod.
Thank you.
Where can people follow you and your work?
Well, I have a blog, petertodd.org.
It's been wonderful. I can't wait to have you back on the pod. All views expressed by me or my guests are solely our own opinions. You should not treat any opinions expressed in this podcast as a specific endorsement to make a particular investment or follow a particular strategy. This podcast is for informational purposes only.